want to make moves in this economy, you really have to understand the ins and outs. You have to cut through the noise of what is really going on. And we have a special treat for you. The one and only Anna Kelly, just 30 or 45 days ago, did kind of a State of the Union of the US economy, a 3-hour deep dive on everything. And she has graciously agreed to add that to the school community that we were doing here at One Rental at a Time. So you could look for even more value coming to you inside school. So Anna, that is such a treat for you to give that away. It was a lot of work. It was a session that you charged for. So having it as a bonus is a true treat. So thank you very much.
You're so welcome. I'm super happy to share it with the community, and hopefully you will sit down and make time to listen to it all. Yes, it's almost 3 hours long, but you can listen to it in chunks. And really what it's designed to do is take a lot of what we've talked about, Michael, on this channel and really deep dive the data so that you can understand, and make heads or tails of all of the conflicting narratives. Or do we have a weak economy? Do we have a strong economy? Where's inflation heading? Where are we in the economic cycle? Are we going to have a recession? And so I kind of talk about big economic shifts, big changes in economic cycles, whether they're short-term or long-term changes, and then what kind of data we look at to determine those things, the data that the Fed's looking at, what's good, what's bad, the data that they're not showing you that might indicate things are not quite as strong as the data that they're showing, and really showing you kind of where I think the economy is headed next and what the Fed might do through the rest of this year.
Yeah, that's such a wealth of knowledge. I heard nothing but great things about it. It was well attended, and the feedback is awesome. So knowing that we can have that inside the school community as just another treat, another extra is pretty awesome.
My
So let's
pleasure.
talk about we haven't spoken for a couple of weeks. I had a trip, so we were off for two weeks, I think. And so what is going on? I mean, we've gotten some lower GDP readings, inflation readings. We got PPI and CPI that came maybe slightly better than expected. We got PCE at the end of the week. What's going on with inflation, economy, and then we'll transition to the Fed. What are they going to do?
Sure. I think the most important thing to hear, and I've said it, you've said it, but just at a very high level, is that we have these, what Lacey Hunt likes to call long and variable lags. And so when you have shifts in monetary policy or a real shift in the economy, such as high inflation all of a sudden, and then the Fed trying to tackle that, it doesn't happen very quickly. It happens very slowly. And so the mantra is always, it's different this time. Nothing has changed. And you've been beating this drum for 2 years, or inflation for 2 years, recession for 2 years, whatever it may be. The reality is that the economy goes in cycles, and that those cycles continue to finish before they, restart and calibrate. And so I think at a high level, Michael, we clearly have had, a very high inflationary period. Cost of living is up average about 24 to 25%. And while inflation numbers are coming down, it doesn't mean that costs are coming down, that we have true deflation. It really just means that the pace at which inflation is occurring is less this time than it was before. So it's still building on inflation. So inflation hasn't gone away per se, but it's definitely the growth of inflation is slowing. And so that's good news for us, right? Because the Fed has said they cannot cut rates until they battle, number one, inflation. But since the last Fed meeting, I think was right before we last spoke, they did finally come back out and say, they were really pushing their two mandates. We've got to watch inflation and we've got to watch employment. And inflation ticked down a bit. So that was good news. The growth of inflation ticked down a bit, not inflation itself. And unemployment ticked up to that number, that 4% that everybody was kind of watching. And so the Fed has kind of told us they're comfortable with about 4% unemployment. And so when unemployment gets to 4 and you start having inflation, they really have to do this balancing act of, how can we keep inflation from going back up? How can we keep unemployment from going back up? And so their decision to pause, I think this time, let's just say may have been a smart move to at least say, let's watch, because sectors of the job market have been strong while many sectors of the job market are clearly weakening. And this is normal when you have a cycle that starts to end. And inflation is coming down for the most part, but there are sectors that show they might go back up. And so this is kind of more of the same that we've seen over this last year, year and a half. However, when we start to talk about a shift of the cycle and we talk about, are we going to have this proverbial soft landing? In other words, can the Fed pull off not having a recession? I still stick by my call at the end of last year that I believe we are in a recession. It just has not been called. At least extremely recessionary conditions when it comes to employment. And what we see in these cycles, which you'll see in the school video, I'll go into much more depth on this, is that unemployment is usually its very, very lowest. And everyone says the economy is booming just before a recession. And then that's why everybody is shocked that we have a recession, because everybody said it's different this time. Unemployment's low. That's that way before every recession. But what happens is when you start to see sectors of the economy and different states starting to see unemployment tick up, that's a sign that the consumer is stretched. We are seeing that. Credit card debt is almost at all-time highs. Credit card defaults, auto loan defaults, housing, we're starting to see foreclosures, even with people with low rates, because they were held off from making payments during COVID, for example. The consumer gets stretched. They stop spending as much. Earnings and profit expectations start to come down as consumers pull back. And then companies start to lay off. And then it's kind of this, opposite of the wage price spiral. It's like, okay, wages go down, prices have to come down, people are spending less, and that slows inflation. So I think we finally kind of hit that mark, Michael, where we really are heading into more obvious weakening, more broad weakening. So when we talk about recessions, they can vary in terms of their depth, their length, and their breadth. How diffuse are they? And I'll stop with this, but I will say that I've been talking about for a couple of months, we've seen two recessionary indicators that are perfect indicators, kind of like the yield curve. They have a perfect track record. One is called the McKelvey rule for unemployment, and one is called the SOM rule. And essentially what they look at is they've looked at every past recession as far back as where we're tracking recessions and unemployment. And they say if your 3-month average unemployment rate goes up either 0.3 or 0.5%, that always indicates that a recession is here. And the SOM rule and the McKelvey rule, one has been triggered in 65% of states. The other has been triggered in, I think, 36 states now. So based on states' own unemployment data, 65% of the US states are now officially in recession according to their unemployment growth during this time. And so I think that this is the beginning, and that it's only a matter of time before we see 2 negative quarters of GDP, which formally will cause the NBER, I believe, to call a recession. I don't think they call it before the election. So I think you have your election and then they go, you know what, we've been in a recession since third quarter of 2023.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen this, but Danielle DiMartino Booth actually has been pretty loud. She said that she thinks they're going to go back to I think she said October.
October, absolutely,
Right. So
absolutely, yeah. And
yeah.
she runs a company called QI Research. Her data is very, very good. I've subscribed to her daily email that she sends out. She's a great writer. But she's not the only one. We have quite a few economists who have been around a long time. And Danielle worked for the Fed. She worked for the Dallas Fed. And quite a few older economists are saying these numbers matter. Watch the SOM rule, watch the McKelvey rule, watch unemployment. But it's very difficult to time it because of these long lags and because of how much helicopter money was in the system at every aspect of the economy, from the rich to the poor to small businesses to big corporations. Everyone got bailout money. And so it has taken a lot longer than maybe normally it would, because the inflation was preloaded with so much money that's been on the sidelines. And we really have this very bifurcated economy, Michael, which you and I've talked about, but it's becoming just more and more evident, even in the last few weeks since we've spoken, where it's very, very clear that the average household, it's more than 66% now, live check to check. And the average American, it's really interesting. There was a survey, and I don't remember if I saw this data from Danielle or it might have been Stephanie Pomboy or Lacey Hunt. There's some economists that I follow, but essentially they surveyed households and said, are you living check to check? And then they asked, are you traveling this summer? And then they asked, are you doing it on credit?
Mm.
It is unbelievable, Michael, because people are still spending on travel and they're putting it all on credit. More than half of people going to Disney are putting it on credit. And so you might see some increased spending in travel and think, oh, inflation's going back up in the services section. People are fine. They're traveling. They're not fine. They're traveling despite not being fine. It's kind of the you only live once YOLO mentality, almost like the revenge travel after COVID, where they're going, yeah, I'm check to check. Yes, I'm worried, but I am going to prioritize the family vacation. So you see these seasonal blips where it makes inflation look a little higher, but that does not mean that the consumer is healthy. In fact, we just see more and more signs that they're not. So the wealthy are carrying the economy and keeping inflation a little higher than flat or negative. Many sectors of the economy, inflation has actually gone negative into deflation of those,
Mm.
especially in the goods side. But the same thing with corporations. You know, there's a lot of the top few corporations are doing well. It used to be the Magnificent Seven. Now it's fewer than that. But most small businesses are really, really struggling right now. So that makes it hard to, connect the timing of the dots of when is all
Yeah.
this going to officially be in recession. But what we see is more and more households are struggling at almost every income level, other than the top 10 to 20% of income earners today.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. So much in that. It's funny. Just this morning, I saw a report from Bankrate that the average credit card rate is 21% today.
Yeah,
If you,
it's crazy,
that's
crazy.
crazy. Yeah, if you're traveling on credit, stop. You know, pay that 21% off as soon as you can.
100%.
Second, Carnival Cruise Lines reported earnings this morning, record-breaking numbers, right?
Yes.
Over 100% occupancy, which I wasn't even sure you could do, but apparently they do. It's wild what's going on with travel. Um, you know,
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a cruise that I booked, I think back in April or May for next February or March, and it
mm,
was almost completely sold out. So, it's things are people want to travel, and people, I think, have been through so much in the last 4 years, coming on five, the fifth year
yeah.
since COVID. So much in terms of, the unexpected death and health issues and job layoffs and cost of living increases that I think people just are saying, we need to make memories. We're still going to do that. And we're
Mm,
going to have to figure out where to cut back everywhere else. And so,
mm,
if you listen to one news channel, and I don't like much network news at all. I really listen to very little. I do from time to time, but it's like different worlds, right? So listeners, people that call me that, want coaching, consulting, whatever, their view of the economy is from network news. And so and I'm just going to make it up because they're viewed as extremes, right? If I turned on Fox, they're going to go, all these people are going on vacation, but they're only doing it because they're maxing out their credit cards. And if I turn on MSNBC, they're going to go, the economy is healthy. Carnival Cruise has, record profits and people are still traveling. And the reality is, if you have to look at all of the data to see, hey, it's bifurcated. It's not
mm.
all in one place. And the economy is not as healthy as people think that it is and hope that it is. And what that means, and again, you and I continue to say this as we try to educate people, is not doom and gloom. It's let's look at the reality of where things are heading, and
Mhm.
let's try to get ahead of where things are heading. Let's not
Yeah.
pretend that it's different this time. Let's prepare ourselves both to protect what we do, protect our wealth and our income, but also to take advantage when we do have that recession that I do believe we are in or going to have. Now, your mileage may vary, as they say. Where you're located is going
Yeah.
to be very different. So just like I talked about, Danielle and some others, Michael Cantoritz, et cetera, we'll go back and look at the SOM rule and the McKelvey rule. If you say that a third of the states are still healthy, they still have a strong GDP, strong incomes, not very many layoffs, but that 2/3 of the states are already having uptick in unemployment and more layoffs, then you're going to know that if you live in areas that have a strong GDP, you may not feel the recession at all. And you're going to
Mhm.
listen to someone and go, you're crazy, right? We
Mhm.
don't feel it. But if you live in 2/3 of the states, you're going to see it. And it's the same with real estate values and different sectors, right? You might find a great deal or be really hurting if you currently own large multifamily, but you might not find a great deal on single family homes in an area that's undersupplied where values are just going up while rates are up. And so, you have to educate yourself on what's going on nationally and then look at how does that impact me and my local economy and the economies where I invest, and then what sectors are the most impacted, and then how do I now go out as an investor to preserve my wealth, grow my income, grow my equity and net worth, and continue to make moves that allow me to profit regardless of what's coming, and especially if we have a deep recession.
Yeah. It's funny, when I heard Danielle talk about that, I actually looked up, I actually typed into Google, how long is the average recession? I thought it was 11 or 12 months. The answer, according to Google, is 11 months. And the reason that's interesting is if she's right about October, we're 9 months into this thing already, which means we're at the tail end, at least of average. So when you're
Yeah.
looking at the recession, because again, you think we're in one as well,
Mhm.
do you think this is going to be just a normal? Do you think this will be longer because of all the money up front? Do you think maybe it goes down as a rolling recession? It has to be different when you pump $8 trillion of free money into the economy.
Right.
It's going to act different.
Right. And that's where, the it's different this time mantra of we're not going to have a recession is laughable, right? But there is truth to every recession is different. They're all caused by a different thing. And depending on what triggers the recession, the depth, the length, and the diffusion,
Mhm.
varies. So how bad is it going to be is, how many people are laid off? You could look at it that way if we're talking about unemployment.
Mhm.
How bad it is, unemployment goes up significantly. How long it lasts is obviously the diffusion is how many states and how many sectors of the economy are experience those high unemployment numbers. And so what I do see is we are already pre-declared recession. 2/3 of states are in recessionary territory of unemployment. So
Okay.
that tells me it's probably going to be pretty diffuse. And I think most states, other than a handful, are going to end up in official recession. Then the question is, how bad does it get? And I think that's what we're all asking ourselves. A year ago, at the end of last year, I was very, very concerned about the health of the banking system and how many local to regional banks go under because of commercial real estate falling. And the same thing that brought down Silicon Valley Bank, and others, basically banks having to mark down the value of their bond portfolio. The same thing happens on commercial real estate where the value of the assets have gone down. Has the bank been forced to mark those values down on their balance sheet, which would reduce their assets, sometimes make them insolvent when you compare that to their liabilities? And if the consumer gets nervous and starts to pull money out of the bank, or they pull money out of the bank to go put it in a mutual fund somewhere or a high yield savings account online, then you have this double whammy. And I do think that if you go back and look at the savings and loan crisis, Michael, it took a decade. So
It
it
did.
wasn't just a bank failed and now no more have failed in a year, so we're out of the woods.
Hmm.
So, I still have concern about the banking system because commercial real estate is not out of the woods.
Mm-mm.
So the longer the Fed keeps rates higher, Michael, before they cut rates, and I do think they'll do it by September, at
Ooh.
least a cut.
Okay.
Maybe in July. I doubt in July. I think they want to save face of being patient. But let's say they cut rates. They might only cut a quarter of a point, half a point until they say we're in recession. Then they'll cut more drastically. But there's so much real estate on the books that has to be refinanced, or the rates are just doubling that they can't refinance, and they can't cover the debt coverage. So there's a lot more commercial loan defaults to come. If it's as big as I think it could be, and it happens quickly in 2024, 2025, then the recession can be severe,
Mm.
on the level of the great financial crisis. It really could be because The banks are what we rely upon for credit.
Mhm.
And when the economy does cut rates and goes back to quantitative easing, they rely on the banks to lend money to people, right? If
Yeah.
the banks are struggling, and I already know as a commercial real estate investor, banks are not giving big loans right now. Even all the banks that issue credit card debt, they're starting to pull back a little bit because they've realized we extended way too much credit, and now people and businesses and real estate investors are starting to default. I think the banks take a big hit. And if
Mm.
that's the case, I think this recession could be very deep and it could last longer. The GFC, I think, technically lasted a little over 18 months of a
Mhm.
recession, but look how long we had a flat economy of recovery. So, regardless of, is it going to be really bad? If it's really bad, 18 months, and maybe you
Okay.
have a 3 or 4 year recovery. The
Mm.
average recession's like, again, somewhere between 10 and 18 months. I know you just quoted 11, but depending on,
Mhm.
what caused it and how broad it was. Um, Even if it's a year, Michael, and we say it's quick, banks don't fail and we're okay. I think that you could have at least a 2 to 3 year recovery because that's average. So what I'm saying is it really doesn't matter quite how bad it gets, quite how long. It's not, recessions or not. We had a recession, it's over in 11 months and things are back to normal. It's over in 11 months technically, and slowly but surely the economy starts to fight back and the Fed puts out quantitative easing, pumps money in the system, goes right back to where we were in terms of QE. And it takes 2 or 3 years for people to stop being gun shy and
Mm.
say, okay, I'm not worried about mass inflation this time. I've got a job back. I'm comfortable to spend again. After a recession, people are going to get even tighter than what they are now. But the difference, Michael, is they'll no longer have credit available to them to go revenge spend. They lose jobs, they lose their credit cards, they shut their credit cards down because they don't want them maxing them out, and people struggle for a couple years. So I believe that we're heading into recession, 2 or 3 year recovery, and it's 3 to 4 years from now before we have a true expansion again. Because there's just nothing in the economy right now to, everybody hopes it's AI, but there's nothing in the economy right now to give us a big enough boost to put us back on a booming expansionary path once we, hit the trough of the bottom and flatline a bit.
I was at a real estate event over the weekend where Ben Malla spoke. Ben Malla, if you don't know who he is a huge commercial real estate guy. And he talked about a couple of things. He said his rates tripled on his stuff. He owns retail and hotels and stuff like that. So they've
Mhm.
tripled. He also said his banks have been reaching out to him, waiving covenants, right? Because again, they don't want to mark to market. They want to extend and pretend.
Yeah.
He also talked about a lot of Wall Street uh, kind of loan packages or
Mhm.
securities. They're calling up trying to sell at a discount. He's like he's like this ain't over, and he's
Yeah.
concerned about banks as well. He does think this cycle could. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but hearing him talk, he thinks 2025 could be pretty ugly because he says at some point the banks can't pretend anymore, and
Right.
they're going to need to do their fiduciary duty and foreclose.
Absolutely. And part of the issue too, I mean, we talk about regional banks, and that's a lot of it. So, your loans up to a few $1,000,000, even $100 million, we were looking at regional banks for $100 million construction project for 500 unit apartment buildings, in Dallas, Fort Worth area. Those are done by usually still regional banks. Sometimes a regional might be a couple of states that they're playing in. So they're not the big banks, but they're not super small mom and pop 2 to 3 branches in a county. So most of the commercial real estate really is done at the regional bank level, and those banks are under bank regulators and credit unions as well. So there are certain covenants that they could waive, but not to the extent that the bank regulators will allow them to do it, because they'll be out of compliance with federal regulations of how much of any one kind of asset can any bank have on its books. minimum debt coverage ratios, for example. Do you have something on the book that's not making payments and it's below its value? So banks want to hold off, but they are limited to what kind of covenants they can change.
Mhm.
When you have big federally backed mortgages, which is really mostly just multifamily, HUD loans, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, those are sold and they cannot be modified. So you go into special servicing. Sorry, too bad, so sad. We can't modify your loan. We don't own it anymore. It's in a commercial backed loan. CMBS and multifamily agency loans as well. So the only thing that can really be modified are bridge loans, which bridge loans are a major part of the problem.
Mhm.
And there are some bridge lenders that are trying to work with their borrowers, not in a cheap way. I mean, they're charging more for it, but if the bridge loan was done by a big fund, and they have the wherewithal and they think that you're in a market that's going to rebound and they see that you're still doing a really good job of managing the asset, they're not going to change your interest rate. It's still going to go up, but they might give you a 1-year extension. So that's happening. But you've got a lot of these other REITs that own real estate that they're going to take the write down. And so,
Mhm.
part of the question is, and Danielle's mentioned this as well, is yeah, we're really concerned about the regional banks, but the shadow banking system, which it's not this like crazy thing. It's
Mm.
just non-bank financial institutions that are
Mhm.
not regulated, nor do they have a really good, nor does the government have a really good understanding of the size of the shadow banking system. They don't regulate it, and therefore we don't know exactly how many loans are outstanding by big financial institutions, funds, family offices, etc. But I know for a fact that there's a lot of commercial loans done in that shadow banking system. So we're
For
not
sure.
just talking about, okay, 65% of, regional banks might have 30 or 40% of their balance sheet in commercial real estate. It's a lot of money. I don't know the exact number, but I've heard anywhere from, I've heard around a quadrillion or more of,
Gosh.
loans,
Yeah.
derivatives, which are loans on loans with multiple collateral, multiple pieces of collateral over time. That's a huge number. So I learned from the GFC
Yeah.
that the financial system is much more intertwined. Yes, there's been a lot of things put into place for banks specifically, through the Basel
Mhm.
changes and regulations.
Yep.
But the derivatives market, the shadow banking system is still not regulated. And Daniel DiMartino Booth believes that part of why Powell is holding out so long is to let them fail.
Yeah.
Let the loans of the shadow banking system, many of which are commercial, let them go, wipe them out, and then start to regulate the shadow banking system
Mm.
post, cutting rates. And so I think there's some that very well could be, based on how much risk it is to the financial system. It's real systemic risk that can really create another GFC if they don't manage it and let it kind of happen slowly.
Yeah.
But the reality is, Michael, now that inflation's slowing, and unemployment is ticking up, I think the Fed will start cutting rates, probably not drastically till 2025. And if they do, we're going to celebrate as investors. But what it means is the economy is worse off than what we think. And
Yeah.
so,
Be careful what you wish for.
be careful, and so you're going to have strains in different areas of your portfolio, such as, okay, my rate came back down, hallelujah. Am I in a market that people are losing a lot of jobs? Is my vacancy going to go up? Are my rents going to have to be cut? Are my expenses going to be high while my rents come down? So, these are just the kind of things we think through and prepare for. You prepare for the worst, you hope for the best, and then when you see opportunity, I still have mostly a lens of opportunity, Michael. So it's not like doom and gloom, it's all over. It's,
Mm.
hey, there's some light at the end of the tunnel because we're seeing the cracks that are necessary for the Fed to cut rates. And the sooner they do it, the less likely the recession will be deep and systemic. The longer they hold rates higher, the more likely more banks and shadow banking financials fail, commercial real estate fails,
Mm.
layoffs happen, and it's a much worse recession. And the Fed knows that. So they're trying to balance that. You know, I
Yeah.
don't think they're going to get out of a recession. No way.
No, I mean recessions are a natural part of the business
Yeah.
cycle. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just they just are. It's funny when I think about the GFC and what you and I were talking about here with all the commercial and regional banks. I do think there's at least a ray of hope that the banks won't be as decimated as they were last time. And that's quite
Sure.
frankly just the equity position, right? Most of the lenders that I saw in multifamily, most aggressive was 75% LTV. Lots of them were 70. Um, so yes, I think multifamily is down 20% nationally. I think office is down, 30 something percent.
Yeah,
But I don't think. I mean, certain there will be regional banks that go out. There are 3 or 4
for sure.
branches in a city that got decimated. No
Hmm.
problem. But I don't think this is going to be catastrophic to the banking system because the equity position's different. There and the other thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is I actually think the losses suffered by individuals will be much worse this time than last time because again, the banks took the haircuts last time, not individuals.
Yeah.
What do you think of all
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, at a high level, I agree with you. I think that for the most part, most loans are done in the 75% LTV range. At least for the space that I play in. Development, it's usually a little bit less than that, 65, 75%, something like that. The real issue though, Michael, is if you did a loan at 70% LTV, okay, and let's just say office and
Sure.
pick the national range of values are down 30%.
Okay.
If I did basically it means that the amount of debt on the books at the bank is equal to its current value.
Correct.
The question is not if that was the only problem, there wouldn't be a problem. We'd say, okay, well, the banks just are going to hold the loan. The issue is bank regulations require them to honor their loan covenants. And so if I have that loan and my property value is down, one issue is that my LTV is no longer maintained because the LTV covenants say
Hmm.
I can only have outstanding the same 70% LTV that I did at the time I bought it. But now
Correct.
my 70% LTV is on the loan amount. So
Right.
in order for a bank to be able to refinance that loan, they have to get a new valuation and they can only lend you 70% of that. Well, now you have to pay in 30% to keep your LTV the same. So unless the banks are given a pass by the bank regulators to say, okay, you can market to market. Okay, you stayed fine. You're not illiquid. You're not
Hmm.
upside down from your assets and liabilities. But if you're not honoring your loan covenants, then now you can't refinance that loan
Yeah.
because that loan it's a cash in refi. So that's when investors hand back the keys. That's what's happening all over the country
Yep.
because the bank can't do it unless they cash in. The
Hmm.
second piece of that, and they're happening at the same time, is the loan covenants contain the debt service
Yep.
coverage ratio. So basically, most loans in the last several years said whatever your net income is, it has to be 125% of the debt. So you
Yep.
got to be able to pay the mortgage and have a profit of 20 to 25% generally. If you're paying the mortgage, but you have no profit or you're in the negative, they can't refinance you when you come up for refinance or when your rate resets. So some banks are looking the other way. And I have had conversations with my bank and said, what happens if when my rate resets,
Hmm.
um, or when the loan resets, if I'm making my payment and I continue to make the higher payment, are you going to do an appraisal, make me pay down to the same DSCR and LTV? Little small regional bank? No. You keep paying, your rate will go up. You keep paying, you'll be okay. However, they still want to look at our financials every year. But at some
Yep.
point, the regulators are going to go, you can't keep this thing going. So,
Yeah.
it's all about regulations. If we start to have a collapse where you have a lot more commercial real estates defaulting and lenders don't refinance or can't, I see the Fed stepping in and saying, just like they've waived reserve requirements that were so important, during COVID, they might say, we want you to work with your commercial real estate investors as long as they're making their payment at whatever the new rate is. Don't foreclose on them because they're not meeting their LTV and the DSCR requirements. So if the Fed does that, it'll definitely contain a level of contagion that there could be. and banks can, weather this a little bit better. The other thing is part of Basel III, the new bank regulations that are requiring a lot more. It hasn't been pushed through yet. Powell's trying to push it through. It requires a lot more reserves. That's supposed to have enough reserves on the banks that it helps a little bit of the potential fallout as well. So I don't think the Fed will let us have the level of banking crisis that
Yeah.
we had in the GFC. I think they'll put stop gaps in, just like we've seen them do at every step of the way post-COVID, to go, we're going to plug the hole, plug the hole, plug the hole, and try to minimize the fallout. I think the Fed's going to throw everything they can, the Treasury, the Congress, to keep us from having another deep GFC. And that's the only thing that makes me really say, despite how bad it could be, I don't think it's going to be as bad as it could be.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. So let's transition to single family homes. There's a lot of chatter. Grant Cardone, Ken McElroy, and others basically saying now that the Fed broke housing. You and I have been talking about that for a year and a half, so others are catching up. But Grant put out an interesting stat that I just wanted to kind of play with, and he said the Fed we need to get mortgage rates to 4%. And his idea is you get mortgage rates to 4%, housing prices will come down, was kind of how he put that together. Keeping them up here is going to stop building and, do all of these things and just could reignite inflation. So I'm just curious, what do you think about the idea of 4% mortgage rates kind of possibly lowering prices?
It's possible. It is possible. In fact, people have made the argument that high rates are keeping prices high, right? When it comes down to anything in economics, it's all about supply and demand. So it's
Hmm.
supply and demand. That's like economics 101. So the question is, where is the demand and where is the supply? So people think about housing values based on interest rates because of demand. So they think, oh, if I have a lower rate, then I'm going to have a lot more demand. And if I have a lot more demand, but I have limited supply, prices are going to go. So initially, when you really cut rates, you have people willing to buy that can cash flow on properties now, right? Or can afford their home. And so you are going to have more demand. And the more the demand there is with the current limited supply, those prices are going to go up. So initially, I think when you cut rates and you get rates, if you got rates to down, I think initially you're going to see a big increase in prices. The question is, and we don't know the answer to this, how many people locked in their 2 to 3 to 4% mortgage will move if rates are low? So theoretically, if a rate comes back pretty close to where most mortgages are locked in, between, let's say 2.5% and 4%, it may cause a lot of people to decide to move, especially if they have a lot of equity in their home and they want to move somewhere else, or they want to downsize because their cost of living's gone up 25% everywhere else. And so if you have this reversal of the lock-in effect, which opens up a lot of people willing to sell their home, then as people increase supply, equal with demand, prices are just going to stay flat. At some point, if you get enough people moving and demand comes down versus supply, then prices will come down in homes. But I think this is another one of those things that has these long and variable lags. It's not going to happen overnight. It's probably going to take a year or two and it's going to depend on how bad a recession we're in, Michael, because if rates come back down that low, it's because we're in a recession. The question is then, is it harder to qualify for a mortgage? Have people lost their job? Are people afraid to lose their job? And how long is it going to take them to find a comparable home? Because the price of anything they buy is going to be higher for a while. And so I think it remains to be seen what it does to supply, and what it does to supply. You need supply to get higher than demand for prices to fall. And I
Yeah.
don't think that that's going to happen right away. I think it's going to take time.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question because, my natural reaction is rates fall, demand goes up, marginal demand comes back. But I do think 4% is a nice kind of number that probably does unlock a lot of supply. But you and I know this, but for the audience, the broken part of the housing market today is the move up buyer. right?
Yeah.
They're just not moving. Lock-in effect. We unlocked that at 4%, but then you know what? Their demand also. The movement buyer is unique because they're two transactions. They sell
Yeah.
one, they buy one.
Right.
And it's it's just interesting. The other thing I think about, if mortgage rates got to 4%, how many people go back and do a cash out refi, right? Because of all this equity people have gotten the last 2 or 3 years.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
just think about all the equity. I think it's like 23 trillion or some crazy number of home
Right.
equity. Man,
Yeah.
you got rates down to 4%. Who's going to do a cash out refi and restart this party? I mean, it's
Yeah,
wild to think about.
absolutely. And the Fed is already coming out with, they already have a second home mortgage program. And now now they're coming out with a new program to allow you to take up to 70 something thousand. I don't remember, 73, 78, somewhere in that range of equity from your home as a second mortgage without going back through appraisals and
Mm.
qualifying, like a quick qualifier,
Yeah,
not, they're
right.
probably like, do you still have your job? How much, are you still making the same amount of money? Your credit's decent. Okay, we're giving it to you. So I
Mm.
just read about that again yesterday. So that's trying to be
Wow.
pushed through. I believe it's through Fannie Mae. There, it might be even FHA. So I got to go back
Mm.
and look at it. But
Yeah.
you know,
Wow.
I think the question is then, and again, all these things impact each other. Housing leads the economy. It does when it's leading inflation and expansion, and also when it's leading, when it's coming down because of recession. But if you might have a lot of people, Michael, that say, hey, I bought this wonderful home that has all this equity. And even if I found a mortgage rate the same as my house today, I still can't buy the same size and quality of home
Yep.
at the same mortgage rate because prices went up so much. So a lot of people aren't going to want to downsize to have a flat mortgage payment. They're going to go, let me take out equity. And then guess what happens? People go spend again. And then that causes inflation again. But again, that's what stimulus does. When people
Yeah.
have access to money, it gets you out of your recession or your personal recession. I've got debt. I'm check to check. Now I got money. Hopefully you pay off your debt, and then you go spend. And then that spending initially helps your economy or your personal economy to recover. And then eventually inflation kicks in again. So, what I'm really kind of anticipating over the next couple of years is that we have a recession, rates come way down, people start tapping into all of their locked up equity. We start to do all the reshoring that we've talked about, and the government starts pumping more money to help the economy recover. And then we come into a new higher level of normal interest rate and inflation all over again. And then we have this flat decade where the government is constantly trying to balance inflation and unemployment and inflation and unemployment. And I think that new level of interest rate comes back higher than that 4%.
Yeah.
So it's really important to watch these things, Michael. And that's the whole point of like the 3 hour course that I did that I'm going to put in your school classroom, is that you have to understand that it's not like tomorrow, if this happens, it's a big change and everything's
Mm.
fine. It's where we have a window of opportunity when it is bad and when rates are really low to make generational wealth,
Mm-hmm.
buy as much as we can, lock in rates as low as we can for 30 years,
Yep.
and then ride up either a flat decade, at least cash flowing and slowly having appreciation, force appreciation. And then eventually you're going to have an expansion again. It's just a matter of, we don't know how long. So let's
Mhm.
invest for it, make good long-term hold decisions. And real estate's always going to be the way to do that in my book.
Yeah. It's not, yeah, we're going to close on this. This is actually my plan. And I'm going to go back to your earlier example. You talked about, we'll call it multifamily. In your example, you called it office,
Yeah.
right? Where you buy it for 100, you get a loan for 70, it's now worth 70. What do you do? Well, my answer to that question is I look forward to that. The bank's eventually going to have that seller sell, right? Either via foreclosure or a forced sale on the market. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to 1031 all my equity out of these high priced homes, right? Which I think will go higher if rates come down. And I'm going to slam all that equity into that 70, which means I'll get a loan at 49. And then I'll just wait because eventually it'll go back to 100. And then I'm at 50% LTV. That's my plan for this cycle.
Yeah, I like that plan at a high level. I'll just give you one caution that I'm thinking about, right? And
Sure.
this is from a commercial investor who has commercial loans and loves multifamily for the most part, right?
Mhm.
There's a timing to everything. And so the question becomes, and I've gotten this wrong. I've been saying I think we're heading for a recession for more than a year now.
Mm.
And I think we're in it, but it's taken a long time to see all of the fallout, and it's not gotten as bad or as deep as I thought yet, right? So I've been wrong on interest rates. I have thought interest rates were going up after the GFC and paid to keep my interest rate where it was, only for prime to drop and be paying higher than I should and paying for it, right? So I've gotten this wrong before. It's not as easy as we talk at a high level, but it's hard to predict the timing. But
Oh,
my
yeah.
point is this, Michael. If I am right in my thesis that
Mhm.
we are going to have a recession, rates are going to fall, that
Mhm.
could drive up values for a bit. But if we start to have inflation again, then what that means is that the US Treasury rate stays higher. And what that means is that interest rates go higher. And commercial values have the same problem in the future that they do today, where
Yep.
the cap rates are higher than what they have been historically. So what I hear, not from what you just said, but from a lot of investors that want the same strategy, is they think, I'll buy it at 70% LTV. I'll wait a couple years and the values are going right back to where they were
Mm.
before. So I'll get all of that equity. I'm buying it at 30% discount,
Right.
and that means it's going to be worth 30% more again. If inflation comes back, interest rates are higher, cap rates stay higher for the next decade
Yep.
after we're through a recession, then I've got to understand that I might have a flat cap rate, for several years
Sure.
that might be right back to where we are today. And so I can't bank on appreciation. I need to bank on cash flow. When I
Love it.
buy these deals, I want to lock in longer term rates that I can bank on the cash flow for a decade. And I can still continue to force the appreciation by forcing an income increase, even if my cap rate ends up a little higher than where it is today. I don't know that it will. But I underwrite deals that way, Michael, when I have the same plan as you, is I'm going to go buy some stuff. I'm going to hold it. I'm going to cash flow, but I'm still have a plan to force appreciation when that
Mm.
next expansion comes. But when the expansion comes, it could still end up with a higher cap rate, which means I got to work harder to increase the income so that
Yep.
I still have that forced appreciation. So I just want to be careful when we say this to say to listeners that aren't experienced in commercial, or anything that's based on a cap rate.
Yep.
Don't assume that it's going to go way up in value. Don't buy stuff that doesn't cash flow. Continue to cash flow and assume that it could take 5 to 10 years for that expansion to hit, bullet speed again,
Mm.
where you're going to hold them for 10 years, not hold them hoping you can churn them
Yeah.
in a 3-year value add like we did in an expansion. These have to be purchases that you plan. I'm holding these for a decade. And
I
you know
love it.
what? If it doesn't get as bad and cap rates stay low and we have another roaring expansion in 3 to 4 years, sell then if you want to. But I'm
Yeah.
not going to sell. I'm going to hold them, refinance them, force my appreciation, and continue to do well in what I already own.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Anna, you are amazing. Again, thank you for that treasure, that gift you're giving our school community. Where can somebody follow you?
Great. You can find me on your show almost every week. Summer, we travel a little bit, right?
Yeah.
You can find me on social media at Anna Kelly, REI Mom. And if you're interested in real estate coaching or investing or looking for syndications when the time is right, you can find me at AnnaKellyInvesting.com.
Thank you so much.